Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis, 6 lines from the top, the 2 dots. The Mishnah said that these collars, they have the collars for the animals, and Kol Balei Shir, they can be Yoitza B'Shir, Nimshach B'Shir, Umazan Alayim V'Taim L'Kaima. While they're still attached to the animal, these collars, where they're still attached to the animal, you can sprinkle the water through the para. Do you want it to be matared? You can be toivel while they're still wearing these collars. So, fragt the Gemara, how could you? Why is the tefillah kosher? There's a chatzitza on the collars that's attached to the neck, that's around the neck of the animal. It has a ring, and the rope is attached to that ring. Now, normally, in normal circumstances, that ring is fastened very securely. It's very tight, and therefore the water cannot come and penetrate in there, and that part of the ring that's attached to the collar, the water will not enter there, and there's a chatzitza. Now, Seises explains the ring is sometimes taken off. It's sometimes taken off the collar and used independently. So therefore, it's not considered part and parcel of the collar. It's not considered one kli, the ring and the collar. Since the ring is sometimes taken off, it's considered separate. If it would be considered one, then it's fine. It would not be considered a chatzitza because it would be all part of the same kli. But since it's taken off sometimes, and it's an independent kli, so therefore all parts of the ring have to be immersed in the water of the mikveh. And normally it's fastened securely and it's tight, so the water doesn't penetrate. So you have a chatzitza. Omar Ravami, he answers b'sharitzchon. We're talking where he banged it and flattened it out, and therefore he made it in such a way, therefore, that it's loose. Normally it's secure, but he hammered it and therefore flattened it, and now it's loose. So therefore the water will penetrate. So we're talking b'sharitzchon. So Zok the Gemara Ravami Rav Yosef Svirle. Well, let us say that Ravami must hold like Rav Yosef. In the previous discussion that we had, that we were discussing previously, well, why were these things become tomei to begin with? The ring, why should it become tomei to begin with? It's a ring that's used for an animal. A ring that's jewelry that's used for people that can be mekabel tumah. But as something that's for an animal, then that type of a kli is not mekabel tumah. So why would the ring be mekabel tumah to begin with? The Gemara answered that 2 answers. Rav Yosef said that since it's used by the person uses it to pull the animal, so it's used for the person. It's considered a kli of a person. That's what Rav Yosef said. And Rav Ami had a different teretz. Rav Yitzchak said rather that it's boying. Rav Yitzchak said it's boying minoi adam unoi behema. We're talking in a case where it became tomei when it was used for a person, and at that point it became tomei. So therefore it was tomei at that point, and therefore that's how it was able to be mekabel tumah. But over here, if we're talking where it's b'sharitzchon, if we're talking where he banged it and hammered it out, well, if that's the case, it's no longer usable as a ring for a person. He destroyed the beauty of it by hammering it. It's no longer usable as a ring for a person. Now, if the whole reason that it's tomei is because it was tomei as when it was used for a person, it was used for a person, became tomei. If now he banged it and hammered it, it would lose the tumah, and you wouldn't have to be toivel it in any event. You won't have to be toivel it. If you're telling me, though, that it's become a tumah because it's used by the person, so if you told me, like Rav Yosef, that it's oil adam meishach behem, so the banging it out would not negate that tumah, would not nullify it as a kli, because it's still used for the purpose of an auto. But if you're telling me that the whole reason that it's tomei is because it became tomei as a ring for a person, jewelry, well, now that he banged it, he nullified that use. So it should not be tomei anymore, and you should not even have to be toivel it. And obviously we're talking where you have to be toivel it. So must be then So Lemar Avami Rav Yosef Sfirli must hold like Rav Yosef. The Rav Yitzchak Nafka, because if you would hold like Rav Yitzchak, the Amr Baboy Minoy Aram Lenoy Behema came the Riskan Avu Maiso Parkalei Tuma Minayu. By bagging it out, he would be doing a Maisa to nullify it, and then the Tuma would depart in any event, and you wouldn't even have to be toivel it. And obviously, we're talking that he has to be toivel. This not because we learn Kol Kelim Yardim L'Dei Tuma San B'Machshava. All the kalim can become tome with a machshava. A keli can only become tome if it's a finished vessel, when it's nigmar. What defines its completion? When the uman decides that he's satisfied with it, he doesn't want to do any further processing. So, like Rashi says, an example, that if he has a piece of leather, he wants to use it for a mat. If he now decides that it's sufficient for this purpose, then it's considered it's a gemar kli, and it can be makabel tuma. So with the machshava alone, he can give it a designation as nigmar, as being complete, and it'll be makabel tuma. But vein oilam tumas al b'shinu ma'isa. But if it became tome, and let's say the mat became tome, now the uman decided that he wants to use it and make leather straps out of it, or he wants to make leather laces out of it. Just having a machshava at that point to say that he wants to process it further will not be matarid. If he starts to cut it up, so now it's no longer usable as a mat, now it's in the middle of being processed. It's not finished as straps, it's not usable as a mat because he started to cut it, then it will be parchatuma. But with a machshava alone at that stage, it will not be. However, when he did a maisa, the tuma would depart. It would be oilam etumos. Now over here, if you're telling me that he banged the ring, so that's a maisa. More says, Savalor Kav Yehuda. Domer maisa l'sakin lav maisa. More answers no. It could be that he held like Rav Yitzchak. That it's with boimi noyora. You're telling me the banging alone would remove the tumah, and you won't even need tefillah? No, because perhaps he holds like Rav Yehuda, that holds if there's a maisa to be masaken, it's only a destructive action that causes the tumah to depart. But if there's a maisa that's beneficial, now even if it negates the original use, like here in this case, it was used as jewelry for a person, hanging it, hammering it, now it destroys the beauty. It's no longer usable as a ring, but it's a beneficial act. It's not an act of destruction. It's an act to make it suitable for the caller. So in such a case, then we say it's a maisa that is from misakin, to be misakin. Even if it nullifies a previous use, the tumah does not depart. The son of Yehuda Omer lo yom shinu maisa l'sakin ela l'kalkel. He says when there's a shinu maisa and it causes the tumah to depart, that's only if it's a kilkul, not a tikkun. But Masnisa Tane, they give another, Masnisa Tane Bryce, they say a different teretz b'chol olim. We're talking where it was loose. So it wasn't hammered, it wasn't banged, it was loose to begin with. And Taisa says that we didn't initially give this teretz. It seems to be an obvious solution because, as Taisa says, that's not the norm. That's not a common case. The derech is that the shear, that it is secure. So therefore, it did not want to give this initially as a teretz, but this is another possibility as well. Shoal Talmud Echad Migol Elyanis Rebbe Elazar Shamati Shecholkim Bein Tabas LeTabas. He said, I heard that there's a chilek, there's a different halacha between one ring and another ring. Amar Loi Shemeloi Shamat Elyanis Shabbos. Perhaps you only heard this regarding the Hilchos Shabbos. The Ilin and Tuma Dovid Achadi. Because as far as Tuma is concerned, there's no difference between them. Is that so? There's no chilek l'gabe tuma. Adam tameya tabas behema v'kelim v'shar kol tabos taharis. It's only a ring that's used for a person that is makabel tuma. Like we learned before, we learned out from Kli Midyan that jewelry is makabel tuma. That's only for a person. But if it's a ring that's used for a behema or for other vessels, then it's not makabel tuma. More answers, ki kamerli nami the adam kamerli. He mentioned it only for a person. In a ring that's used for a person, there's no chilek. Is that so that there's no chilik, there's no difference? A ring that's used for a buckle, or it's used for shoulder straps. If for a buckle, it's tahira. They only said that it's tameh only for a ring that's used for a ring for your finger, jewelry. Otherwise, it's not makabel tuma. More answers. Ki kamarli unami the esba kamarli. He said there's no chilik in a ring that's used for the finger. There's no chilik as far as the hilchas tumar is concerned. If it's a buckle, it's a ring that's used for a buckle, for a belt, etc., or shoulder straps. Over there, that's not called a ring. It's not jewelry, and a person doesn't actively use that ring, so it's not called a odom. It's used for odom moishech behem because it's not used actively. So that's not makabel tum. But a ring that's used for the finger, that's jewelry, it's makabel tum, and there's no chilik in that. Is that so that there's no chilik? It's all the same. We learned in the Mishnah, if you have a ring that the base is metal, and the seal is made out of either cedar wood or coral. So therefore, that is considered a pshuti kli eitz. It's not makabel tuma, but the metal is makabel tuma. So if the base is the ring itself is metal, it's considered a kli matras. And even if there is no cavity, so the seal fills up any cavity that there might be in the ring. So even if there's no cavity, it's considered pshute kli kelim. But pshute kli matras, a metal kli, even if it doesn't have a cavity, a knife is makabel tuma. So we treat, if the base is made out of metal, we treat it as a kli matras, it's makabel tuma. Then it's tamei. But he shall almug v'chaisme matras. But if the base is made out of wood, cedar wood or coral, and only the seal is made out of matras, tahira, it's considered a kli eitz, and it's pshute kli eitz. It's not makabel tuma, it's tahira. So you see that there is a chilik even in a finger ring. More answers. But he said what he meant to say is that if it's a ring that's made out of metal and it's used for a person's finger, there is no chilik in the halacha. So So therefore he said, legabe Shabbos, there's a chilik. The legabe Shabbos, there's a chilik whether the ring has a seal or it doesn't have a seal. If it has a seal, then that ring is considered carrying. If a person wears that on Shabbos, it's considered carrying. It's not considered a item of jewelry. So there's a chiv chatas. If it doesn't have a seal on it, it's jewelry. There's also midrabanan. There's a chilik. Legabe tuma, if it's a metal ring, then there's no chilik. It's makabel tuma regardless. I heard that there's a chilik in needles. There's a chilik between halacha between one needle and the other. In your Shabbos, perhaps you only heard that legabe Shabbos, that there's a chilik. Because as far as tuma, there should be no chilik. There should be no difference between them. If there is a needle that's used for sewing, so if a woman goes out with it, even if it's stuck to her clothing, it's considered carrying. If it has an eye of the needle, it's used something that would be used for sewing, that's considered carrying. And there's a chiv chatas. If it's a pin or needle that's an item of jewelry, then there would be no chiv chatas. That's considered a tachshit. It's not considered carrying, but it's also midrabanan because you might take it off and show it, or might come to carry. So there's a chilik. But lenyan tuma, he said there's no chilik. Is that true that legabe tuma there's no difference, there's no chilik? If you have a needle that the eye was removed, or the point of it, then it's tired. It's considered broken, and it's not makabel tuma. So more answers. But what he's talking about, where it's not broken, it's complete. Is that true that by Shleima there's no chilik? If it's complete, there's no chilik. If the needle is rusty, it got rusty. If you can't sew properly, if it catches on to the garment and it gets stuck, and then you can't sew properly, so it's considered like it's not usable for its intended purpose, it's tire. There's no tumah. But but if it's rusty, but as long as it's usable, it doesn't get stuck, it doesn't catch on, then it's tar, and then it's tamea rather. V'im lav tamea, then it's still usable. It's not considered a broken kli, and it's tamea. And can be makabel tuma. Now, when do we say that if it's rusty, then we say that it's a taharam? He said if it's rishuma nikr, if the pin, when you sew with it, if the rust remains on the garment, if the rust stains on the garment, then it's considered no longer usable, and it'll be tahar. More answers. Ki kamerle b'shifa kamerle. He said, "Enechanami, you're right." Then we say you're right. Then we say that, but if it's polished, there is no chilik. When is it true that there's a difference? That's if it's rusty, then yanachanami. But we're talking in a complete polished needle, there's no chilik in the halachas of tumah. Fracting more b'shifa Dovid achasi. Is that so? That if it's polished, it's all one and the same? We learn in the brayso, if you have a needle, whether there is a hole in the needle, an eye in the needle, it's mutar l'taltal. Now, this we're not talking about to carry it outside. It's not talking about mitzvah. It's mutar l'taltal. It's not considered muksa. If it's inside, it's not considered muksa. It's mutar to be metaltal. Why? Because it always has a use. If it has a use that's permitted on Shabbos, because you can't sew, obviously, but it can be used to remove a thorn or something that's stuck in a person's skin, or it can be used for permitted uses on Shabbos, and whether it has the eye in the needle or not, it still can. There's a use that one can use for that, a permitted use on Shabbos. So it's not muksa. They only said the chilik by nekuva is l'gabei tuma. If it has a eye of the needle, then it's a kli. It can be makabel tuma. It can be makli. It's makabel tuma because you can use it for intended use for sewing. But if it doesn't, then it's not usable for the intended use, and therefore it will not be makabel tuma. So you see that there is a chilik even by a polished needle. And even though it's not broken, that there is a difference if it's been completed with an eye or not. What Abaye answered, explaining Rava's position, is that we were talking about a unfinished needle. If the needle is unfinished, then that's when we say that it's tahira. A kli can only be makabel tuma if it is a finished kli, if it's nigmar. If it's not nigmar, then it cannot be makabel tuma. So it says, lo yamrin in the kuva elayin tuma. If the person making the needle had intended to complete it with an eye, then if it's not complete, the eye is not done, it's not makabel tuma, it's not a completed kli. So therefore, there's a chilik if there's an eye or there's no eye. That's when the uman intended to complete it and make a hole in it. However, if he did not intend to make a hole, if he intended to use it without the hole, therefore it's considered complete, and it's even without the hole. And it's regarding that he said, that Rava said there's no chilik whether in a machar or one to the other. If you're talking about a polished needle that one intends to use with or without an eye, then there's no chilik. It's makabel tuma whether it has the hole or it doesn't have a hole, and that's what Rava was referring to. Zok the Mishnah chamor yitzmeradas b'man sheikshur, that a donkey can go out with a saddle cloth. They used to put a cloth on the donkey to keep it warm, and then saddle on top of it. That the donkey can go out with it because it keeps it warm, as long as it's tied to it securely. And then we're not afraid it will fall off, and it's used for the protection of the behemoth, then it's mutter. Zechorim yotzim levuvim. Zechorim, they can go out with when it's tied, fastened, and securely to them. Zechorim are yotzim levuvim, rams that can go out if it's levuvim. Rechelois, the female sheep, yotzes, shchuzois, kavulois, ukavunois. They go out when they have it tied to them as well, whether they're held or tied or fastened. The Gemara will discuss in greater detail what precisely this means over here. But it has to be secure. Ha'izin, goats, yotzes, truers. The goats can go out if it's tied to their udders, if they have the covering is tied securely to their udders. So they used to tie the udders in order to either stop the flow of milk, so that the goats can either get fatter or bear children, or sometimes they would tie something around the udders to collect the milk. So they're allowed to go out through rice when they have the garment attached to the udders. But the Mishnah will qualify this with an opinion momentarily. Rabbi Yossi oiser b'kulan chutz min rachelim hakvunos. He says they're all oser except for the female ewes that go out with the kvunos. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer is in the case of the goats yotzes thruas liyovesh avoloy lecholim, that the goats can go out thruas only if the purpose is to dry up the milk and not have it the milk flow, but not to collect it. If the purpose is to collect the milk, then it's also because we're concerned it won't be tied securely enough, and it might fall, and you might come to carry it. It's only if it's liyavish, to dry it up. So the Reish of the Mishnah said that the chamor can go out there with the saddlecloth. Amar Shmuel shur lo me'erev Shabbos. It's qualified only if it was tied from before Shabbos. If it was tied on Shabbos, then you can't. Now, the Rishonim speak out over here that we're talking, of course, you can't do a kesher shel kayom on Shabbos, that's also, but even if he does it in a way, the knot, which the knot would not be also on Shabbos, it's still also. It's only if he ties it from before Shabbos, which shows us that he wants the animal to, now he needs it for the warmth of the animal, he needs it for the protection, the warmth of the animal. If it's done before Shabbos, it can go on Shabbos. But if not, then it seems that that's not such a concern. The warmth of the animal is not a concern, and therefore it's not permitted on Shabbos. Amar Rav Nachman Snisan Medika, you can be medaik this halacha from the Mishnah. It says in the Mishnah that the animal cannot go out when the saddlecloth is not tied to it. So heichidami, what does it mean? If it means it's not tied at all, so why does the Mishnah on the Nundala have to tell us that? Pshita. Of course it can't. If it's not tied at all, it'll fall and come to carry it. Of course we wouldn't allow that. So it must be that it's talking, meaning when it says it's also if it's not tied. If it's not tied from before Shabbos, that's what it means. If it cannot go out with the merdas unless if it's not tied from before Shabbos. So it must be that Armish, which says that it's mutter, is when it is tied me'erev Shabbos. That's when it's mutter. Shmami nam. Tanya namahachi, and we learn similarly in a brisa. It says clearly that it can go out with the saddlecloth if it was tied me'erev Shabbos. So you see clearly from the brisa that it has to be tied me'erev Shabbos. The brisa continues, Tanakama says, but the saddle itself, even if it was tied me'erev Shabbos, you cannot go out with the saddle. The saddlecloth is used for warmth. The saddle itself only gives a limited amount of warmth, so you cannot go out. It cannot go out with the saddle. Rav Shimon Gamliel Aimer, he says no. You could. The saddle also gives warmth, and it could. However, there's a qualification. The saddle gives warmth, and enough warmth to say that we consider it for the protection of the animal, the benefit of the chamor, and it could go out. However, if it's secured and tied in the way that it's normally done at a time that it's transporting things, it can't, because it looks like it's being used for transporting, which is, of course, also on Shabbos. So therefore, he says, if the saddle is just tied securely, but not in the way that it's normally tied when it's transporting things, which has to be tied in a way that it doesn't slip out of place, then it's mutter. So therefore, Rav Shimon Omer Apuv, it's manshik shur lo Erev Shabbos, as long as it's tied Erev Shabbos, number one. However, but he cannot have the straps that are around the chest of the animal to hold it in place, and it doesn't have the strap underneath the tail, because that way, if he secures it in that manner, that's the way he does it normally when it's using for transporting things, so it doesn't slip out of place, and it looks like it's being used for transportation, so that's also. But otherwise, as long as it's securely fastened, then it does give warmth, and he holds that it's mutter.